Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 226. And today we have Soyoung Lee talking about higher education as students' academic self-formation. Before I introduce Soyoung, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Some of you will have heard this before. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website within the next 48 hours or so. It goes to YouTube, and that's where we're seeing an increasing number of people viewing the webinar, but not, of course, able to take part. It's better to be here live, and you'll have your opportunity to join the webinar, in effect, as an active participant during the Q&A. Now, during the webinar, we advise you to please keep yourself muted and your video off, unless you're at the stage of coming into the webinar to ask a question or make a statement. We recommend using the speaker view in the top right-hand corner there, so you can more clearly see who is speaking at any given time. Now, to ask a question, write it down in the chat. Then we'll know you're interested in coming into the Q&A, and we'll be able to select you in an appropriate order. Generally speaking, if your question or your statement are relevant to the presentation and you make them early, perhaps towards the end of the speaking time or just after that, then you can be almost certain that you'll be part of the Q&A discussion. If you bring your ideas forward too late, like the last 5 minutes or even the last 10 minutes, you might miss out. So do come in early if you have a good idea to contribute to the discussion. When you're invited to ask your question during the Q&A, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce Soyoung Lee, because I have to confess an interest in this presentation. I am one of Soyoung's doctoral supervisors at the University of Oxford, Department of Education, and it's a great pleasure to work with her on what is an important and original study in my view. She's a second-year doctoral student in higher education. Her research interests include international students, student agency, and cultural difference in higher education. Her doctoral research is fully funded by Oxford. She has a Clarendon Scholarship, which is the highest award that a doctoral student can hold. I should say that her other supervisor is Stephen Putik. Hope you're listening today, Steve. If not, you can view it on YouTube. Soyoung, the screen is now yours.
Thank you, Simon, for your kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen so that I can begin my presentation. Yeah, hope it works. So again, thank you everyone for coming in. Thank you, Simon. And thank you, Trevor, for having me for this webinar. This CGHE webinar has been one of the most important academic stimulus during the COVID-19 situation for me as a doctoral student. So I'm really honored to be contributing and to be part of this webinar series today. So my presentation has been advertised with a title called "What Do Students Do?" and Researching Higher Education as Students' Academic Self-Formation. And just like my title of my presentation, I'm going to start with a question. So there are questions for you. Why are you in higher education, and what do you want from universities? And what is higher education? This is such a big question, and millions of answers can be drawn from these questions. And answers for that questions are linked to what higher education is. And as you can see, as I will introduce in this slide, the dominant ideas about what higher education is actually related to how students are formed and student formation and what students do in higher education. So there is one dominant idea of higher education that I will explain. The human capital approaches, everyone will understand, everyone will know that it is very influential idea in higher education research. And in this approach, higher education enhances individual earning power. That's a very simple sentence about what students do in higher education. And then as higher education becomes more international and the number of international students are growing, there is another perspective that is dominant and prevalent in understanding international higher education. That is called adaptation models, in which international students are known to adapt to the host country. As you can see in this left side of this model, it is very general idea of what adaptation is and what students do in international higher education. It shows that students should master something, which is host country's culture or academic skills that are needed to succeed in host country's idea. They are similarly talking about what students do in higher education and as a result, what higher education is. But what is missing is they are not necessarily talking about student agency, although they are talking about students. So there is a need for a paradigm shift. That's about what higher education as student self-formation. This emerging idea to understand what higher education is has been popular, as I will see in this following slides. As you can see in the picture, very childish, I'm sorry, very colorful. So what students do in higher education in self-formation is not being other forms, just like human capital theory or adaptation unwittingly assume, but students are self-forming. For example, self-formation idea places reflexive agency at the center, which means that unlike or beyond human capital theory, it is not higher education that transforms students, but it's rather students who transform themselves. And at the end of the higher education, it is not something desirable results that others like teachers, institutions, and society think, as in these dominant ideas. The desired self or the student self is the end of higher education. So it is called work on the self of the self, as Simon said. And this is also, I have to emphasize that self-formation is an umbrella concept that incorporates many different ideas within this concept instead of like opposing other ideas. For example, human capital theory, the increasing earning powers and also adaptation to host country, they are also a student self-formation, if that is what students want to do. So they are not like opposing idea. Instead, self-formation is more comprehensive idea. That's what I'd like to emphasize. And this idea of self-formation has been proposed by Simon in 2014. And then he also had this paper, which is based on a lecture in UCL. So they are called International Education as Student Self-Formation and Higher Education as Self-Formation. Based on these ideas, the summative theorization of self-formation, Simon, at the end of this paper, has suggested that, has called for more empirical supporting for this idea. And actually, as I said, it has been popular among researchers because it is a very normative idea. And then like everyone can say yes to this idea. And students also, as a student, I said yes to this theory. So empirical research has been done is, I have reviewed 200 articles that has cited Simon's paper in 2014. And then they usually used self-formation idea as assumptions, rationale of their study, conceptual framework, and some of them researched what self-formation is. And also, most of the studies used self-formation idea as an interpretation of their findings. So, for example, to interpret their findings, they regarded self-formation as something positive, not negative like adaptation experiences, not international students who are struggling, but something positive and dynamic, not homogeneous, but heterogeneous, and agentic student experience, especially in international higher education. But as you can see, researching higher education, as self-formation, there have been lots of opportunities that we could elaborate this idea of self-formation. And what I did was finding some emerging questions that I'd like to build on previous research. For example, first one was self-formation so far has been confined to explaining student experience, especially in international higher education. But what I understand is self-formation is not confined to students' experience, but it's more like what higher education is. So I argue that self-formation idea should be more expanded to understand what higher education is. And in order to do so, we have to distinguish how self-formation is higher education and self-formation in other fields such as school or workplace or maybe gym are different from these different fields of higher education as self-formation. So I wanted to see what is distinctive in self-formation in higher education. And also, as I said, since the researchers previously have focused exclusively on international students' experiences, there are reasons why, because international students have been framed more negatively and more struggling than local students. And so this idea, this emancipatory and empowering idea of self-formation was more required it was more pressing issue, understanding international students as self-forming agents. But by doing so, I wondered, then, okay, then researchers assume that mobility influences student self-formation because international students are mobile students. But how do you know that really mobility influences when you don't study local students at all? So, and also, self-formation is not confined to international higher education only. It's a broader idea. That's what I thought. So, and also I wanted to say that local students also need this agentic focused understanding, because if you have been a graduate student, you might have seen this video.
Look at me, I'm a grad student. I'm 30 years old and I made $600 last year.
So as most of us have been a graduate students, we made terrible mistakes and we made terrible decisions in our lives, right? This kind of prevalent negative discourses required self-formation discourse in local higher education as well, especially postgraduate students, but not only postgraduate students. Yes, I'll stop. And then also there is more important issue about how to research this idea of self-formation, because self-formation has been very broad and normative, as I said. It has been difficult to research. So there has been no agreement regarding what self-formation is. I wouldn't say no. There has been little agreement between researchers. And then since it is too broad a topic, if you study international student self-formation, their first year experience as self-formation, you wouldn't find that much difference between studying international students adaptation, because adaptation is involved in this idea of self-formation. So researchers might end up with finding something that has already been known to the literature. So that was the problem. And then what is my study finally? I wanted to focus on academic aspect of self-formation, because self-formation is broad topic. I have to focus on one aspect of self-formation. And since higher education's distinctive nature as a field of self-formation required to focus on this academic aspect of students' experience. So I wondered, and the first research question is, what is higher education as academic self-formation? This is very conceptual question, and I needed conceptual research methodology to answer this question. And secondly, I also wanted to see how this mobility affects students' self-formation indeed, and also by studying mobility as an important impact of student self-formation, I would be able to expand this idea of self-formation towards local higher education as well. So the second question is, how do students engage in academic self-formation in local and international higher education? Yes, so these two questions are different in nature, because the first one is more like conceptual and second one requires empirical data. And the third focus is South Korean students. South Korea, I'm from South Korea, and you might just say, hey, Soyoung studying South Korean students because she is South Korean. But it is more than that. And some of you might also think, why do you study South Korea? It's so small. You can just study China or US, but it's not like that. South Korea is very special context to study self-formation, because first, South Korea has recorded the highest world top gross tertiary enrollment rate in the world, with over 95, which means that everyone goes to university. And then around 80% of South Korean university is private, which means that students pay for their university. So 95% of students in Korea pay for their university by themselves. How important higher education is among South Korean people. So that is one of the points that I wanted to argue. And South Korea is also one of the Confucian cultural heritage countries, of which higher education as self-formation has lots of similarities, because self-formation is similar to the idea of Bildung, German Bildung, and also American pragmatism, and also Confucian self-cultivation. So I wanted to see how this idea of self-formation, higher education as self-formation, was entrenched in South Korean culture among South Korean students. So that's why I'm studying South Korean local students, South Korean international students, and the similarities and differences between these international and local students' self-formation experiences. Then let's move on. In order to answer this question, I had to establish, find a right and adequate theoretical framework of reflexive agency of students. Because agency it's a really great concept, and we should focus on this agency, but sometimes it's used as something like Silverblatt, something panacea, that you just say agency for the question that you don't know. This reflexive agency idea should have been conceptualized appropriately. So that's why I adopted this idea of Archer's Morphogenesis model to understand what reflexive agency is. The reason is because, the structurationist agency, such as Anthony Giddens and John Bourdieu's, they see somehow structure and agency conflated, and agency is involved in structure. Meanwhile, Archer's idea of reflexive agency is that this agency and structure is separated and independent from each other, but linked by reflexivity of human being, which means that reflexivity is that individuals deliberately and consciously negotiate between this agency and structure to make decisions and make choices. That's what reflexivity is, and that's why I thought Archer's idea of reflexive agency is closer to the idea of self-formation. And then the morphogenetic cycle is suggested by Archer, and it says that the structural transformation has three phases. First is structural conditioning, second social interaction, and third, the structural elaboration. Based on this idea and reflexivity, I developed a conceptual idea of self-formation, which is that students are conditioned by their agency and reflexivity at the beginning of their higher education, and they engage in interaction between knowledge and other things in higher education as well. And as a result, students elaborate themselves. But I have to emphasize that this is a cycle rather than a line of development. So this elaborated self transforms the conditioning factor of students' self. So it goes to another cycle of self-formation. So it's just like that. So the conditions of self-formation is reflexive agency, and agency is restrained or enabled by contextual factors and contextual resources. And finally, students construct themselves in a transforming form. And as I said, this is a cycle that iterates and continues and ongoing with irregularity. Great. And then based on this idea of conceptual framework, based on Archer's idea of agency, and also Simon's theoretical work on self-formation and empirical work on self-formation, I developed a list of hypotheses of student self-formation. But I have to emphasize as well that these are not the hypothesis in quantitative research. It's more like a list of inquiries and list of ideas that I'd like to elaborate throughout my research. So first, as you can see, students are strong agents. And for this main hypothesis, I developed three sub-hypotheses based on Archer's idea. So students adopt personal project, and second sub-hypothesis about students' agency is that students reflexively interact with their context, and lastly, students reflect on themselves. These three sub-hypotheses of student agency is the main focus of today's presentation, because I can't elaborate all the hypotheses that I developed today. But I'm going to briefly introduce the second hypothesis about self-formation. It is about resources, and as the current discourse about self-formation research has been centered on international students' experiences, the main resources identified in previous research was intercultural interaction, mobility, and communicative competence. And third, students construct the transforming self. It means that students use multiplicity and hybridity as possible strategies for self-formation instead of being in transition from A to B or choosing between either or options. And as I said, it is transforming because the self-formation does not finish. It's continuous and ongoing process that is always in movement. Okay, and then let me introduce my research design. The Archer's idea of morphogenesis, it transcends, it penetrates my research design and my research questions actually. So this research design can be said morphogenetic because it starts with working hypothesis that I showed right before. This conditions my research, right? And then at the first data collection point, I collected not only conceptual research data, but also empirical data. This interaction between conceptual and empirical research will complement each other to develop the conceptual framework of self-formation and to revise this developed hypothesis of what academic self-formation is. And then this integrative analysis, which is elaboration of the working hypothesis, will lead to the second data collection point. At this point, I'm going to say that this research takes ethnographic approaches, which means that it's not, I can't say this research is traditional ethnographic because lots of limitations due to COVID, but it took characteristics of ethnographic research, such as it is a longitudinal study, and it has an emerging focus, which means that I collected this data for my conceptual and empirical data at my first data collection point, but at the second data collection point, I'm going to focus on more selected data collection, conceptually and empirically. This is one of the features of ethnographic approach. And then I revise another level of working hypothesis. And then I conduct last gradually narrowed focus of self-formation idea. So I develop final model. This is a research design. And then I'm going to talk about conceptual methods. For my conceptual research, there is a method. So there are tons of research that shows or manifests what self-formation is. So I'm going to focus on the literature or research program that shares assumptions with self-formation. For example, self-formation is a universal phenomena across culture, across development phases. And yeah, it happens, it can take place everywhere. So I'd like to focus on research program that shares this assumption, and also self-formation is empirically researchable, and self-formation is distinctive in higher education. So research program that shares these assumptions have been included in my conceptual research. And second, this lines of research on conceptual research, it is more like a conversation between self-formation and these theories with emerging themes. For example, I'm going to show you this lots of letters. You don't have to read this. This is just an example of the development of my conceptual research. I start with this, student development theories. And then not only the student development theory is elaborated by self-formation, it elaborates what self-formation is. And then finally, the result is emerging question. And then according to this question, I go over to the second research program, social cognitive theory. So with this process, I conducted my conceptual research. This is a more feasible development of my conceptual research. I don't want you to read everything, but you can just focus on this. I studied student development theories, and I found that student agency was missing. And then I tried to see the psychology of agency in social cognitive theory. And then there's emerged question about how agency is exercised. And then I did the self-determination theory, and it talked about intrinsic motivation as agency manifestation. But what about academic aspect of self-formation? They didn't answer this question. So I moved on to research that studies students' learning in higher education, that is students' approaches to learning theories. And that, but at the end of this review of this SAL research was that, what about content of learning? Because they talked about how they students study, but not about what they study. So I moved on to, and they also confined to, restricted to deep and surface dichotomy of agency practice on cognitive level. I wanted to go beyond agency practice in information processing theories such as cognitive load theory and executive function theory. But they also talked about information, but not disciplinary knowledge that students actually encounter and engage in higher education. That's why I moved on to sociology, knowledge in higher education research such as Polashin, Macklin, and cases study that they have this research program that I looked into. And then this is where I am in progress now. So as you can see, this is the development of my conceptual research, and there's also empirical methods. One is participant selection. As I said, I have 7 local and seven international Korean students from 3 British universities and Korean universities. They are all postgraduate students so that I can focus on academic aspect of self-formation, and they are all first-year students so that I can focus on the mobility impact. And let's go on. So data collection method is Tomley class observation throughout the 3 data collection periods and photo elicitation and end of term interviews. As a whole, I collected 72 hours of interviews with emerging focus, which means that interview questions has developed throughout the research data collection periods. Okay, then I have to emphasize that data collection periods has been different in Korean study and UK study. But it was possible because of the design of my research that was a recurrent mode of digital ethnography. So as you can see, it was digital data collection, and UK study and Korean study was intermittent so that I could focus on one research site while I am studying the other at the later stage, right? So I'm going to introduce the preliminary findings. I have to say that this is I'm still in progress of my data collection, actually. So I'm sorry that I can only show you my preliminary findings, but it's also very interesting. So I hope you like it. As I said, there are 3 components of this idea of self-formation: reflexive agency and contextual resources and self-construction. But now I'm going to focus on reflexive agency. So in reflexive agency, there were 3 sub-hypotheses. First was about students' adoption of personal projects. About personal projects, my conceptual research has revealed that personal projects have been often replaced by others' projects. For example, deep approaches to learning and knowledge acquisition or integration to universities, transformation of students, and greater social justice. These are all projects formed by others instead of a project that students established by themselves. But if you can see this empirical data that I collected, a student said that I always wanted to study abroad, the life in drama, like partying. I watched lots of British drama and I admire the Western university life. This kind of account of their motivation to come to university doesn't really fit one of these ideas or others project. It is personal project, right? And there is also another account about students' personal projects. I'm a YouTuber. I came across lots of replies from young people about how fat they are. I thought this is a big problem and I wanted to explore this by studying media. So these 2 accounts about their personal projects could sound a bit different, because one is about their social and cultural experiences in international education, but the second one is more related to the knowledge engagement part. So the top one could be more like extrinsic motivation, one might say, and the second one might be more related to intrinsic motivation. But what self-formation does is, personal projects are actually a combination of intrinsic as well as extrinsic motivation. And you know what? These 2 accounts are actually from one student, which means that students' personal projects are multiple. It's not one. It's not homogeneous and it's very dynamic, and people have, and these personal projects are also evolving as as been seen in my longitudinal data. And also, these personal projects are developing in close linkage with disciplinary knowledge. This was very prominent in my data because, this is the self-determination theory that I looked into. It was one of the conceptual research that I conducted. As you can see, students' different adoption of personal projects can be understood as a can be understood as a varying extent of agency practice. So this this student's idea, the top account of students motivation, extrinsic motivation to study abroad, is not something that lacks of agency. It's more like regulated, externally regulated agency. That's what self-determination theory says. And as I said, the development of personal projects are closely related to knowledge engagement. This account, Korean research fields of art are very close. So she wants to introduce this Korean research on art to the international research area, international discourse. So that was one of her personal projects. And this one, he worked when I worked for a company, I experienced a lot of technical limitations and lies in the engineering market. He studies engineering market and he wants to solve these problems that are prevalent in engineering market. So as you can see, these personal projects of students are multiple and also very closely related to students' knowledge engagement. But what about the second sub-hypothesis of reflexive agency? It says that active relationship with environment. What does it mean? I can explain this by using this history or development of psychology, because when I looked into psychological work, I found really identified very interesting flow of theoretical development. There was a lot of different flow of understanding how people behave to explain human behavior. First was behaviorism. So it explains human behavior by environment. So it says that human behavior can be reinforced by manipulating environment. And also the cognitivism rather focuses on inside of human brain or inside of human cognitive system to understand how human behaves, and constructivism accepts the impact of social impact on human cognitive system, but it does not actually elaborate how agency and structure are related to each other. But yes, so this is a very general understanding about research on students learning in higher education. As you can see, there's pre-stage, process, and product. It's basically input-output model. There's an input of knowledge and everything, and there's output of students' formation. But this lacks the idea of agency, don't you think so? Because this is computerized imagination about student formation. But there's a more emerging ideas such as agentic self-environment relationship, suggested by Banduras, psychology of agency, and also self-determination theory of ranentisy. They argue that not only human agency is shaped or conditioned by these environmental factors, but human can also produce or control or regulate these environmental factors, maybe on cognitive level or physical level indeed. So what I found was that students in higher education do not only tend to reduce discrepancy, but they also produce discrepancy. For example, in adaptation theories, international students are motivated to reduce this inequilibrium caused by their transition to a new environment. But what I found was that students, yes, they do avoid challenging environments and they want to make environments more desirable by maybe adapting or maybe by reducing the gap between their desirable earning power and their current earning power. But what they do is in addition to that, they also seek out challenging environment. They not only reduce discrepancy, they also produce discrepancy. For example, I'd rather be demoralized or facing difficulties than having to be boring, mundane, and meaningless tasks. Getting C for a challenging work is better than getting A for an easy, boring work. Do you see this student's tendency to seek out challenging environments? You might say this student is special, unique. But what about this student? I learned that I'm failing again and again, but the failure is a default setting, which means that he has to take it for granted. That makes him continuously learn and gives reasons to try again. This is more obvious. She already knew that she will face difficulties in this new environment, but that was one of the reasons why she came, why she studied abroad, isn't it? This is why I say this is why there is a limitation of adaptation theories and other dominant ideas, because other dominant ideas about students' transition, because it focuses on how students react or respond or cope with these struggles and these difficulties they face, but they do not actually study what motivates students to transit and how students are flourishing based on this experience of struggles. How about this? This is more interesting, actually. She said, I'm giving myself a hard time intentionally. I'm digging my own grave. So she's intentionally giving herself a hard time, which means that she gives herself challenging works again and again so that she can expand her idea of herself, expand the possibility of her work that she can do. And this role of agency, this role of academic knowledge is also it's also very prominent in this active relationship with agency, between agency and environment. I can say that academic knowledge mediates this relationship because, as Ashen's work elaborated, knowledge transforms self-society relationships. So in his research, there was students developed their accounts of knowledge from very separated idea to gradually more immersed to this idea, which means that their relationship with society has been transformed by their engagement with the knowledge. Yeah, and their relationship with the self has also transformed. Great. And Bernstein's famous argument about this disruptive power of academic knowledge also indicates that students' active relationship with environment can be mediated by knowledge. And the final finding about reflexive agency, the third sub-hypothesis was about exercising self-reflexivity in higher education. There have been lots of manifestations of self-reflexivity in the literature, actually. Self-efficacy is the one, and deep approaches to learning actually talks about metacognitive learning, which is basically self-reflexivity, and epistemological development also develops student self-consciousness and executive functions. This theory actually shows this brain image that there's a part of brain that enables people to exercise self-reflexivity. And what about the empirical data that I looked into? So self-reflexivity that I found was exercised for regulating the self and discovering the self, evaluating the self, which means that the regulating and discovering is quite easy to understand. But I want to highlight this part of evaluating the self. At the end of the term, during the end of term interview, I asked students how, out of 1 to 10, how would you rate yourself? And then none of the students out of 14 students of my sample gave more than 8. So the 8 is high. 8 is high score, but what I wanted to say is Korean students' self-cultivation and self-reflexivity is mostly based on their self-critics. But at first I thought, okay, let's see the second. I don't think I have done my best 100%. I always thought myself lazy and not hardworking. I have to work harder. Everything I regret every day, every night I regret myself. Why am I not working hard? Why can't I use the most of my time? These accounts, maybe for some researchers, perspective can be account of struggling, or the idea of difficulty that it means because students are not satisfied about themselves. But from the self-formation perspective and students' self-reflexivity idea, students are actually not giving themselves 100% because they think that they have more way to go. They want to grow further. For example, this last account, I'm 70. If I'm 100 already, it means I have no more growth. So yes, students, it's a discrepancy production, I guess, yes. And also the self-reflexivity is shaped by knowledge engagement because it shapes their understanding about themselves, of course. And then, as you can see, the self-critics is mostly based on their work, their study, and how hard they are working on their studies. Great. And do I have time to talk about additional findings? So this additional findings is just brief. Students, I'm not saying that students are not struggling. Some students do struggle, and most of the students struggle at some point. And actually there was a failure case. One of the students had to suspend the study because she failed every courses that she took in her first term. But where there's struggle, there's also determination, because these students that I said, this student is taking a 1 year, I don't know, 1 year during her suspension. She is now back in Korea and studying English and studying how to write essays by herself. And she's also saving money to go back to the UK after her suspension. Yes. And some might ask, what is the effect of COVID-19? Is it still international education, and is it still effective or saying some important ideas about self-formation of international students during COVID-19? But I'd like to say that, yes, of course. And it's even more, there's more opportunities actually because caused by this COVID-19. Because students, yes, before they knew that there will be language-related difficulties, social and financial risks, they have to go out of their comfort zone. But now they even have physical threats of COVID-19. But they'd rather come to the UK, which was really dangerous at that time, but rather than staying safe back home. This gives an opportunity, a very good opportunity to study student self-formation and what higher education means to them. So conclusion. So I revised hypothesis of academic self-formation based on this morphogenetic research data collection and analysis. I'm not going to show everything, but I can show you this first one. Students adopt personal project. That was the working hypothesis. Now I elaborated as students adopt multiple personal projects that supports and supported by knowledge engagement, and students interact reactively and proactively with environment, and also students discover, evaluate, and regulate themselves through academic knowledge. That's what I elaborated so far. Yeah, maybe I can introduce the other parts of my revised hypothesis in my next presentation. And then there's an implication and future research. I think this research can support future research and student self-formation. And then also questioning the assumptions underlying higher education research, and not only that, providing a new conceptual and empirical perspectives on students in higher education. But there are so much ways to go. I have to do this. I'm going to analyze my data when I finish my data collection in Korea so that I can see what is really the culture of self-formation in Korean students and cultural differences as well, and comparative analysis of this to international and local students groups. And there are new themes such as conformity. So I like to conclude with this account from a student. It says, I'm here to receive. She said that her motivation to come to university is to be free and to be safe, actually. She said she can fly as she wish within this safety net of university. So maybe I'm assuming and I'm arguing that maybe this question, what do students do in higher education, that many previous scholars tried to answer, maybe it should remain open to really understand what student agency is. because previous research, maybe the underlying dominant idea and assumptions about higher education, it may be projecting students as agents, but they want to guide students' agency in a way. So this in turn deprives of students' agency. So this is ironical. So I argue, instead of trying to answer this question, what do students do in higher education and what is higher education, maybe we can let this question there so that it can be answered by the students who are self-forming in higher education. Maybe it's the best way to understand higher education and students who can fly as a really strong agents. So this is a reference of the key reference of my work, and I think I can finish. I'm sorry if it was too long. Thank you.
Well, great slides, Soyoung. Really, really effective in conveying your ideas, complex ideas, and you're drawing on many others. So we did need more time, I think, you had to rush in the last 10 minutes, really, but really good paper. Now, we've got a number of really interesting things coming through in the chat. We've only got, really the absolute maximum about 19, 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do is take people in brackets of 2. We'll take 2 questions at a time. Soyoung, you'll then have to try to be succinct in your answers if you can, and answer 2 people asking about different things in each answer. So be ready for that. Our first bracket is going to come from Glenn Chatelier and Yusuf Oldak. So can I invite in Glenn at this point? Glenn.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Simon. Soyoung Lee, your paper is really very interesting in as much as it is going to challenge you and it challenges us. Okay. So within the framework of your analysis of self-formation, say the external agency, students at the end of the day need to be self-affirmed, right? That's the psychological end. That's the psychological goal of all learning. And I see tensions over here, particularly for international students, entering into A, the broader culture of the international experience, B, the academic culture in which they interact with their co-learners and with also their guides, as they move towards the intensification of their study and all of that. And I wonder how much of self-formation, involves self-affirmation in a gradual stage. It seems to me that in the cases that you've shared with us, the Korean students typically, they look at a very sort of challenging environment, okay, and then they are defeated by elements such as language or maybe the different approaches to learning, etc. And I'm just wondering how much of the affirmation gets into self formation early so that it progresses towards a greater success rate. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, for reaching the end of the question. The next question is from Yusuf Oldak, please.
Hello. Soyoung, thank you for your presentation. Very colorful and thought-provoking. So now that we know you're studying academic self-formation, could you please elaborate on what non-academic self-formation could be? When you said, like, I study this aspect, academic, I immediately thought, oh, there could be other aspects. So, like, how did you decide on choosing the academic aspect of self-formation? And while making that decision, which aspects did you decide on dropping out, if any? Like, this is not a normative question. I want to learn your thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Yusuf, and thank you, Glenn, for your questions. Glenn, I don't think I understand the self-affirmation idea. I'm sorry. Self-affirmation. So it means I'm sorry. What is so okay, I'm going to go to Yusuf's question first. So it says you asked a really good question about what non-academic self-formation. That's actually a question that I'm trying to answer, because I started with this list of hypotheses about student self-formation, and then I was also wondering, what is academic self-formation? At first, I thought it was confined to student learning, like cognitive idea of self-formation, but it was not confined to that cognitive system. It was more than that. As I progressed my conceptual research, this idea of academic self-formation has actually involved sociological idea of how students form themselves in social level by using the academic knowledge, not only this cognitive level. So I would rather say what is not academic self-formation would be something that's taking place in higher education, but not exactly related to knowledge engagement. For example, you can say, you always say about your being sociable and how you're being sociable and how what else, culturally experience something new, something cultural experiences that could be not necessarily related to academic knowledge. Somehow, when students, because there are lots of resources for academic self-formation, as I said, and they could be related to these cultural experiences, but I would rather say that students' formation specifically related to knowledge engagement, especially disciplinary knowledge, instead of something just new information or idea, would be academic self-formation. I don't know if I answered your question. And the last question, Simon, would you help me?
Perhaps not, Soyoung, because we've got quite a lot to come. Let me bring in, perhaps can I, and if you
Okay.
don't want to take that question on, let me move to the next questions, because there's a few people lined up.
Yeah.
We'll now bring in Paul Ashwin and Natia Timsina. So Paul.
Thanks, Soyoung. Really enjoyed that, and there's really interesting parallels between what you're doing and what we're doing in our CG project. So we should have a continued conversation outside of this seminar. But thank you very much. My question is around. I felt that the conception of agency you were using kind of had quite a lot in common with ideas of sovereignty. So your concern about whose project is it, and is it really the student's project or is it someone else's, and is that imposed on them? And my question around that is that, you know, for a lot of relationships, I can understand that, but there's something particular about educational relationships that requires an educational intention on the part of the educator. So there is part of subjecting yourself to someone helping you to define your project. And particularly in our study, we kind of found that for students to develop more inclusive ways of understanding disciplinary knowledge, they needed to understand that they were in an educational relationship that would change them. So I was interested in kind of how central that sense of sovereignty is to your understanding of agency.
Sovereignty.
And the other question in this bracket is from Natia. So, so can you come in, please?
Hi, Magisad. Did I correctly pronounce your name? I'm sorry if I made a mistake. And can you see me? I am sweltering under hot sun, living in the garden. I will be very brief, partly complimenting what my colleague said just now. My question is about the choice of method, the tools, what do you call that? The approaches that Lee uses, as very often I hear also, I read also that the debates on the subjectivity versus the agency approach in research. I myself was in Nepal. I'll quickly sum up, and doing my PhD project, and a lot of students have developed this, what I theorize as subjectivity as a good student from higher education. They wanted always, as Lee said, I fully agree, wanted to go to Western Hemisphere And when they mean that, they mean much more European horizon of progress, much more American, Australian. And, you know, Nepal, when I talk Nepal, I think many of you already have in your mind an object of poverty or a very poor country. That is also I found in many researches, you know, and I myself was actually a bit critical to say that the students in Nepal were actually not having, you know, the sense of the self-fostered sense of good student was actually fostered by the pervasive global discourse of international education oriented toward economic model of life and intellectual life, rather. That is what I found, and I was curious that Lee might, you know, why Lee nowhere talks about. I mean, well, subjectivity as another way. Maybe this may be a bad thing that I found in Nepal or a bad approach I did. I don't know. I'm trying to learn more from smart students around the world. Oxford University, Harvard University. That is where I don't come from. I come from the margin of the modern metropolitan university. You might call it. I did my PhD from Denmark, but my field was very much in Nepal. People don't want to know much about the small things, small numbers, or small experiences, and that do not count as knowledge today. And that is what surprised me, and I became a bit critical about also picking up traits like this in research. I am still learning. I'm a student. Sorry that I asked so many things, maybe. So agency and this one, the reflex. I will show my PhD. I talk about Foucault versus Levinson, talk much about agency, identity, and subjectivity. He said somewhere that he is very much inspired by Foucaultian idea of identity as a notion of power. But I found myself, you know, I drew actually a clear distinction. I actually tried, I actually tried to develop a clear distinction between postmodern, post-structuralist, Foucaultian way of thinking about this subject, and the relation between the two, how people think and how subjectivity is formed. But you talk as that they have agency, a reflexive agency, and that through which people understand things or the world. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Nichir, we might give Soyoung a chance to respond. I think. I mean, Soyoung, you've got Paul's question about the reciprocity between self-formation and the curriculum and the teacher.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, fundamental, obviously. And then you've got another fundamental question from Nichir about the distinction between agency and subjectivity and identity. But all worthy questions, I think. So over to you.
Exactly. Thank you, Simon, for summarizing the questions. Yeah. First, Paul, thank you for your question. I always wanted to talk to you, and then it's my honor to have a question from you. And then your question about sovereignty, and then your idea and your advice about that. I've never actually thought about how my idea of agency is related to sovereignty, actually, but the relationship between curriculum and teacher's role and this institution's role and in student self-formation, that is one thing that I wanted to be cautious about, actually. I didn't elaborate in my presentation, but I'm not degrading the role of teachers and institutions. Of course, they have an important role, but what I'm trying to do in my research is that to focus on, to have a perspective of students instead of saying student formation, student formation is a responsibility of the student themselves and also the curriculum and other players in higher education. But I'd rather use this lens of students to understand this role of teachers and curriculum as well. Thank you for your question. And then the next question about subjectivity and self-formation. That's I came across this idea about subjectivity when I conducted my conceptual research. And this subjectivity is something I didn't actually look into closely, but from my understanding is that subjectivity and self-formation is closely related, but they are different because subjectivity doesn't really, it's focused on agency indeed, because it's about the subject, it doesn't place students as an object or human as an object, but it's the students as a subject of playing the power. But the thing is, subjectivity does not talk about how one subjectively understand themselves and also act on themselves. Instead of its ideology, instead of phenomena. That's what I thought. A process. Yeah.
That's, I think we can't get into a dialogue, unfortunately.
Yeah,
The final questions are coming from Lauren Boltz and Jason Chung. So Lauren.
Hi, Soyoung. I have a question about if you could speak more about whether you think that international students approach higher education with self-formation in mind. I know you mentioned a bit about that at the start. And then if you could talk about how that kind of plays into the massification of higher education, I think that'd be really interesting.
And Jisoo.
Hi, Soyoung. Thanks for the interesting presentation. My question is very brief. I understand this is ongoing work. So how many participants are you planning to interview further? And then with what criteria? Are you also considering to diversify the majors? Because I believe
Is it me?
Jason, we lost the sound halfway through your question. If you could just have another go, that would be good.
Oh, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about with what criteria are you planning to recruit more your research participants? And I was wondering if you consider their discipline majors, because I believe the field of knowledge that they are studying highly affects this academic self-formation.
Definitely.
Definitely, yes. Thank you, Lauren and Jisan, for your questions. First, Lawrence, speak more about international students approach higher education with. Do you think this changes with the massification? Do you mean how international students understand their experience in higher education as self-formation? That's what I think. That's what you thought. That's what you meant.
Yeah, kind of like why do they choose to go to higher education?
Why did I choose to go to higher education? Yes. I see. I understand. So the implication about the massification about higher education, because it's okay. So the massification of higher education is difficult to understand, difficult to be understood by the human capital approach, because it's no more as powerful as before the massification. Then this is where self-formation comes actually, because not only there's previous ideas that students would go to higher education for, but students actually transform themselves and they have personal projects in their minds to go to university. And about international students, yes. So so international students' idea about self-formation, and then I can't answer this question because international students have different ideas about their personal projects for their self-formation. But my sample of students said that there are a couple of categories that I found, but yeah, some social problems, social motivation, for example, related to their knowledge and also their society. By using their knowledge, they want to maybe contribute or relate to the society, but also they want to, as I showed the accounts of international students in the example, they also want to culturally and socially interact with people. That kind of different ideas and self-formation projects there are for international students. And for Jason's question, yes, I haven't told you about my sampling idea and sampling criteria, but I have already recruited all the participants that I needed. And then there are 14 students in total. And the sampling criteria was actually a diversity in disciplines and diversity in level of studies, not within postgraduates. So yes, included disciplinary diversity. And I hope that this tells something about academic self-formation. in terms of different types of knowledge.
Soyoung, we've reached the end of the time, and I want to thank you very much for sharing your research in this very open and clear way. It's apparent from the questions and from the discussion that we only just scratched the surface of the issues that you opened up, and we needed another hour or two to properly address them. I mean, I think a really strong point is coming through from Paul, where he points to the fact that we're talking about knowledge here. And that knowledge is not something that students know all about before they start to learn. And knowledge has been formed by the collective projects of many others, and it's articulated through the teaching process as well as the learning process. So there's a social process going on here, and the self-formation process is intersecting with all these relational factors, these social factors, where the agency of others is clearly part of the mix. And knowledge is the product of the agency of many others. And it's an ongoing, changing, evolving product, just like the self-forming student is changing and and evolving. So you've got these two things in motion: the knowledge relationships, the knowledge content, and the self-forming person, all moving at the same time. And so that the intersection, I think, then becomes more complicated but richer, when you think about it. It's not just all being directed by the student, that's for sure. And I'm sure that's not your argument either. But I think we need to think about how we explain self-formation as not simply self-referential, that it does involve intersubjectivity on a vast scale. The social dimension of the self is really important, as well as the inner life of the self. Okay, folks, that was a great discussion. Thank you for participating. We had an excellent audience for a complex conceptual topic like this. Our next webinar is next Tuesday on the 20th of July. We're reaching, it's the second last of the pre-summer break period in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's being led by Brendan Cantwell from Michigan State University in the US, and he's accompanied by Matt Grossman and Caleb Lucas, who are both at Michigan State, and also Jelena Brankovic from Germany. So, and they're going to talk about the intersection between academic work and the organizational environment, the institutional organizational environment, and make the argument that, that environment is full of inertia and doesn't change all that easily. So some of the things we fear about our academic work as being transformed perhaps aren't quite as realized as we think. And at the same time, it's the task of reform is difficult because of the inertia of the environment. So that's an interesting discussion, I think, academic work and the organizational environment, quite pertinent to higher education studies. So we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Do participate, do ask questions, do take advantage of the galaxy of talent we have coming through from Michigan State and from Germany. So bye for now, and thanks very much for being with us. Thanks again, Soyoung.
Bye.